All right, everyone, it's time to get serious about emoji. Joining us to discuss a few stories in the emoji world is Jeremy Burge, founder of Emojipedia. He takes emoji serious. How's it going, Jeremy?
Hello, very good. Good to be here.
It's great to have you here. You've written a lot about emoji, obviously, blog.emojipedia.com. We're going to talk about a few things that you've written up here and kind of peel it back a little bit, because I feel like sometimes when emoji comes up on these shows, it's kind of a running joke, but it turns out lots of people use emoji, and there's very good reasons why. But before we kind of get into that stuff, let's start by chatting a bit about a few of the new additions. They're happening all the time, it really seems like anyways. Tell us about the new emoji hiding beneath the surface of Microsoft's most recent Windows 10 Insider build.
So this is the latest release of what will presumably become the Creators Update, and that added Emoji 5.0 support, which is the gendered emoji support, where you have the male version of female emojis and vice versa. And it's got the interracial couples, which is interesting for this one because Windows and Microsoft are the first to support this, which it's something that other platforms have trouble supporting because of the number of variations. But that's sort of buried below the surface. It's very hard to find these because they're not on the regular input for the keyboard.
How does a platform like Microsoft's Windows suddenly be how is one platform able to launch something like this where other platforms aren't? I don't know. I guess in my mind, it feels like it would be more of a universal thing. Like they all get it at once, but I see it's probably more on the platform level that something needs to be updated in order for this to happen. Why is that?
Right. Unicode adds an update every year where they'll approve a new list. What happens with the interracial couples, though, is these are a sequence of existing emojis and people can add them to their platforms whenever they want to. These mixed race couples they're not out of spec with the standard, but they're not officially recommended, so that Microsoft can do this whenever they please. And if you send this to another platform that doesn't support them, you'll actually see the breakdown. You'll see the backwards compatibility. So you'd see a woman, a heart, and another woman, as opposed to on Windows, they'd show the combined glyph. So it's quite a clever technology they've built in there.
So is it the kind of thing where Unicode is kind of the basis, and then platforms are able to add, they can add to it, but they can't subtract from it, right?
Right. You've got a minimum level of support, and no one needs to support every Unicode character if they don't want to, but effectively the regular code points are the baseline, and then these sequences are sort of an additional thing that you can add if you want to.
And then when a company like Microsoft rolls out these kind of unified, like biracial couples is one example, whereas the other platforms are putting together the glyphs, the piece plus piece plus piece together in order to simulate the same thing. In Microsoft's doing so, how then does that end up permeating into the other platforms, or does it? It's not always necessarily a lock that it will. It could be just a unique thing that Microsoft's platform has. Is that right?
I get the impression that other vendors might like to do this, but because they don't have vector fonts like Windows does, Windows can actually they have all the families set up where there's 52,000 combinations of family emojis because every person can have a different skin tone. And the other platforms, at least iOS and Android as they exist today, would really struggle to add that many glyphs to any font.
Yeah, for sure. Surprisingly, I would say Redheads don't have representation yet in the world of emoji, but apparently that's about to change too, right?
Maybe. It's the Unicode technical committee meeting this week, and Redheads have been on the agenda for about 2 years now. They keep popping up, but the last proposal was put forward last year for custom hair tags, that every emoji could have its own different hair, but that was deemed a bit far for most vendors to be keen to support. So this week there's a discussion about maybe there should be a more limited Redhead implementation put forward.
So wait, let's back up there. There's an emoji council that meets. Like how does that work?
Yeah, it's surprising to people, but I'm on the Unicode emoji subcommittee, and we meet every week, and that's over the phone. And then there's a quarterly meeting which takes place in person. I'm not there this time around, but it takes place every quarter where new emojis are approved, and all the vendors get together, and it's Google and Microsoft and Apple and Twitter and all the people involved, and they literally sit around and make decisions about what is going to happen.
And that's super cool.
The craziness about this is just the depth of differentiation there is in with human beings. Essentially, there are an unlimited amounts of combinations of things. Burke, who helps out here in the studio, says on his little paper, black hair with orange tips. I mean, at some point, that's a joke, but really, I mean, at some point, we're talking about opening this up so that everybody can customize, can be represented in whatever way they choose. It seems like such a complicated thing to tackle, but so I guess it would make perfect sense that there would be a committee figuring out which things rise to the top of the surface, right?
It's an impossible task, right?
Yeah.
You can't actually document everyone on the planet, so it's a matter of making pragmatic decisions about where you draw the lines. Naturally, Redheads opened the discussion about whether you should have other hair colors as well, or should you support baldness or gray hair on all the emojis. So every discussion involves around what precedent you're setting as well, so where that puts the standard in future. So it's an impossible challenge and just chipped away at 1 year at a time.
Sure.
Well, I would like to, as a member of the many thousands of people with sideburns, I would like to lobby for a sideburn emoji so that I can be represented in my text messages.
Could I say there's a beard emoji coming this year? So maybe if you fancy getting a bit more growth, you could be supported there.
Honestly, I'm really amazed that hasn't existed already. But
I don't live in Williamsburg, so I'm going to pass on the beard emoji. But
if we could differentiate to beard and then neck beard, that would be great too.
There you go.
So obviously, tons of variability between platforms. That's a big deal, a big challenge for unifying emoji across the board. Android users, as Ron and I both are very used to seeing little boxes, sometimes with X's in them, in place of where the emoji would be when it's sent from another platform. Why is Android particularly behind the curve? And I mean, maybe the better question here is Android the only platform that is kind of experiencing this type of subpar experience when it comes to emoji?
Android is alone in this for the most part. That obviously, as you know, and you've discussed about having OEM updates, and sometimes every vendor doesn't necessarily update to the latest version for all users. And that's really the issue, that emoji updates are tied to system updates because emoji fonts are built in at the system level. So if you don't get new updates for your Android release, you don't get the new emoji updates either.
Right.
And that's a problem, Jason, that, as we just mentioned a couple of minutes ago, we are very familiar with in terms of doing the system update. But I've got to say, as somebody who's up to date on the Android platform, I welcome the new emoji, and I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that creepy clown. That creepy clown emoji is thumbs up, man. That was
pretty
good work.
amazing. Pretty amazing. Yeah. And to be honest, Google is doing a good job with their emoji support. They're right on it. It's just when you get the updates. Google released their emoji support earlier than Apple did last year. So it's not that they're not doing their job. It's just on the other end that if you can't get it to the end users, I know when we looked at Emojipedia users, we were showing only 4% of Android users on 7.0 or above. Google says closer to 1%. And that's a huge issue. When the vast, vast majority of Android users are seeing empty boxes, then that's no good. How do you know what people are trying to say?
Subpar. It makes you feel like something's broken when you see that. And it also makes you feel like you're just not part of the conversation, which is absolutely true, right? And that kind of leads into my next kind of topic, I suppose, is that it's easy to look at emoji, and I know I'm perfectly guilty of this, and think of emoji as like a toy or a game, or you know what I mean, like not take it seriously. But in the digital world that we live in, when we're typing as much as we do, emoji actually plays a pretty important role. So in that case, it conveys an emotion. Many times it conveys an emotion, a feeling, a characteristic that can sometimes be very challenging to put into words. So in that case, it really does feel like you're being left outside of a particular conversation. It's like suddenly, you can't read French, and suddenly half the conversation is in French and you'll never know what it said.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It is fun. People do like to make fun, and I understand it. It's a funny technology, and it's fun to have, but it's absolutely the best thing we have. We don't have anything else within the text standards to convey what emoji can. So while it's pretty amazing that we actually have this pretty diverse set of characters that work in any text field on any platform, and that does allow us to say way more than we could without them. So without that, I don't think people would actually genuinely prefer a world without them, even though some people tend to say, wouldn't it be better to have no emojis at all? They're the worst. But in reality, they are convenient, and they're quite helpful to have.
Hey, sometimes when you're, especially, I mean, the limited text, mainly with text messaging, when you're limited to a small amount of characters, I'm somebody who wants to be succinct and to the point. Sometimes that's, smiling face with the two hands gets across what I'm trying to say better than explaining the emotion I have right now. So it adds a visual component to our language, which I think is, really changed the way we communicate.
There's a laziness aspect as well, which is brilliant. As you call it laziness, call it efficiency, but nonetheless, there is a great angle. And even some things are just really difficult to convey, like sympathy, but send through a love heart to somebody, a friend who's wants a bit of sympathy, and you get out of jail free card. That's amazing. You've done a great job, and you just sent it through.
If you really want to creep someone out, you send them this emoji, right, Brian? Yeah. Fascinating stuff. Emojipedia. So is it, it's blog.emojipedia.org. Is that right? Is that where people can kind of follow your work online in the world of emoji?
Yeah, that's got the latest emoji news, what's happening.